Hey everyone, I hope everyone's doing well today. And what we're going to talk about today, I think, is pretty interesting. We're going to talk about the different types of bosses that are out there that run the mob. For example, we're going to talk about what type of boss was John Gotti, for example. What about people like Joey Merlino or Carlo Gambino? So, what I've been able to find is that there's seven different types of bosses out there, and we're going to talk about those, and we'll talk about which one's the best, which one's the worst, and also understand that many of these bosses are going to have more than one characteristic. But what I've been able to find is that there's overall seven characteristics of a boss, and we're going to talk about those. So, without further delay, on to our feature presentation. So, the first type of boss that I'm going to talk about today is the earner. That's your moneymaker boss. And so the earner is always business first. They think like a CEO. They're less interested in body count. They're more interested in profit margins, diversification, and insulation from risk. And they'll use violence, but it's more of a tool and not an identity. And the bosses that are the earners are obsessed with steady income streams. They're involved in unions, construction, trucking, gambling, loan sharking, white collar scams, and they delegates the violence downward. And they prefer more white collar capos and people around them, and they often push the family into more legitimate looking businesses. And a prime example of this is Paul Castellano. He's basically a meat industry mogul who wanted the Gambinos to look more like a conglomerate than a street crew. And it caused a lot of problems, obviously, because there was this divide between the blue collar guys and the white collar guys. But the thing is that Paul Castellano understood that the main emphasis of the mob is to make money. And you also had others that I could put in this category as well. Angelo Bruno with Philly, the docile Don on the surface, but he was quietly raking it in from gambling. He got involved in everything from unions, everything going on in New Jersey, and he wasn't one that was typically involved in the dirty parts of the mob. And then you could also look at Sam the Plumber de Cavalcante. He was this talkative, business-minded Jersey boss who, in my opinion, ran the family like a mid-sized regional company. So these are the earners, bosses who look at a gun the way a CEO looks at a stapler. Necessary sometimes, but not the core business. Then you have the enforcer. This is your ruthless and violent boss. And for them, violence isn't just a tool, it's a brand. And these bosses rule by fear. They purge, they send messages, and their mob families go into a high casualty, high paranoia mode. And typically what you'll see with these bosses and the families is high body counts, internal purges, this warlike mentality, constant turnover at the capo and soldier levels. And typically these bosses are going to have shorter reigns because violence draws heat, informants, and RICO cases. Prime example would be Albert Anastasia, the Gambino boss, also known for Murder Incorporated. And he's the textbook enforcer boss. His reputation for violence was almost mythic, and he took over and got rid of the previous administration for the family that had been around since the beginning of the mob in New York. So basically, or from the beginning of the commission, going back to 1930. Also, you could look at people like Vic Amuso. Under Amuso and Casso, the Lucchese's lived in a permanent war economy. And then you had Nicky Scarfo of Philly. He took Bruno's relative stable Philly family and turned it into a slaughterhouse. The perfect enforcer archetype for Philly. And so these are the enforcer bosses. They don't just use violence, they lead with it, and the family bleeds for it. Third, you have the diplomat. I call these the collaborator boss. They believe in power through relationships. These bosses excel at alliances, negotiation, compromise, and commission politics. They keep wars from breaking out or make sure somebody else fights them. And typically, what you'll see with them, they're excellent at reading people. They're good at managing egos, and they maintain good working relationships with multiple families. And they're very comfortable dealing with politicians, labor unions, and businessmen. And for me, the perfect example would be Carlo Gambino. He's the prototype diplomatic boss. He's patient, calculating, alliance driven. Also, you could also look at Tommy Lucchese. He was deeply plugged into unions and political circles, and he interfaced smoothly with the other bosses and even legitimate figures. And even though we said Angelo Bruno was an earner, he was also a diplomat. He fits in here too. He kept Philly relatives stable by cutting deals instead of starting wars. He got along very well with New York. And then fourth, you got the ghost. Basically, this is the boss that hides in plain sight. And they believe in invisible power. These bosses obsess over being low profile. They don't wear flashy suits. They're not in the press. They often use front bosses or acting bosses to take the hits while they quietly run the show. And typically, these type of ghost bosses, they live modestly, or at least appear to. They avoid cameras, they avoid social clubs and nightclubs, and avoid headlines. And like I said, they often use a front boss to absorb law enforcement attention. And to me, the best example of this is Benny Squint Lombardo, the Genovese family. He ran the family from the late 60s through the 1970s. And he was the real power, while you had guys like Fat Tony Salerno and Vincent the Chin Gigante that were more handling things on the front. And Lombardo was a boss that even some of the other families weren't even aware of, but he was very effective in his role as boss during the late 60s and 1970s. And so we have to use him as probably the primary example of the ghost boss. And then you've got the rock star. And so this is where you have the celebrity mobster. This is public persona as part of the power. They love the cameras, or at least they don't run from them. They court fans, the press, and a kind of twisted fame. And typical traits for these type of bosses are flashy clothes. They have the social clubs. They go to nightclubs. They don't mind photo ops, and they're surrounded by loyalists who enjoy the spotlight culture. And it's weird that jurors and neighborhood people, and even some cops, become weirdly starstruck by the rock star boss. And as you could expect, the prime example of a rock star boss is John Gotti. He's the template. He wore the three-piece suits. He walked out trials like they were movie premieres, and he had the friendly waves to the press, and sometimes would give a statement. And so John Gotti, brought a lot of attention to himself. And I don't think that, especially in the 80s, once you had Rico and all that, it became more of a liability than being a strength. But Gotti was also the ultimate gangster. He didn't care what people thought about him, and he wasn't afraid of anyone or anything. But he was the rock star boss. And you could also put Joey Merlino in that as well. And basically, to me, when I look at the rock star boss, they're kind of half gangster, half celebrity, and unfortunately, they eventually pay the price for both roles. And next, you got the traditionalist. That's your old school traditional boss. They're obsessed with Cosa Nostra as a sacred institution. They're obsessed with the codes, the rituals, the hierarchies, the old world values, and they see themselves as a custodian of a way of life and not just criminals. They're typically big on ceremony, loyalty, omerta, and the image of honor among thieves. They're suspicious of drugs, the youth culture, media attention, and typically these type of bosses will clash with younger, more reckless guys. And there's a couple of good examples for the traditionalists. Joe Bonanno of the Bonanno family. He wrote about the honorable society. He tried to pass the family to his son, and he kind of saw the mob almost as this dynasty. And then Joe Pravacci, very old world, deeply Catholic image, very conservative in his lifestyle. And, he bled his men financially, like what we've talked about previously, but he was definitely an old school boss. And I would say the traditionalists are the bishops of the mob world. They're guardians of ritual and structure, even as the world around them changes. And then finally, we have the CEO. This is what I call the modern boss. And you have to understand that everything has changed because of RICO. So the CEO boss is more the post-RICO, post-wiretap bosses, and they think more in terms of risk management and corporate structure. They kind of combine the earner, the diplomat, and the ghost, but with this explicit compliance mindset. How are we not going to go to prison? And typically they structure operations to keep the boss insulated from the day-to-day crimes. They use lawyers, tech awareness, and strict communication discipline. And they realize that RICO, surveillance, and informants are constants, and they're not surprises. And I would say that the ultimate modern day boss, the ultimate CEO boss, is Barney Bellomo. He's modern, low profile. He runs a sophisticated organization built to survive RICO. And he's a hybrid of earner, ghost, and CEO. And these guys don't want the headlines. They want plausible deniability and a good attorney. So those are the 7 types of bosses that I see that's out there. Did I leave any type of bosses out? Or is there one that you could think of that I didn't include? Which boss type is most important? Who do you think was the best type of boss? Which one was the worst type of boss? I'd love to hear the discussion in the comments. And so that's all I have for today. Hope you enjoyed today's show. And until next time, take care, stay safe, and God bless you always.